All right, so welcome to governance and adoption for Microsoft 365 and really for Microsoft Teams, so making the marriage work. I am Mr. Strand and this is Mrs. Strand. I guess a little bit about ourselves. I'm going to say ladies first.
Thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Megan. I'm a change management consultant. I've been working with Office 365 for about 8 years. Started off in project management, but most of it solely based on adoption and the user experience and the strategy. Like Lorian, I'm an MVP, Microsoft Service Adoption Specialist. You know, this slide is just, I guess, giving a bit of an idea of where we come from. You know, got a heavy project background and I get pretty obsessed with process and the whole thing. And you?
I'm Lorian. I don't have a bucket to stand on. I'm actually a little bit taller than Megan here. So I've been working with Office 365 since the BPOS days, and actually even before that, dating back to NT4. But the thing is, I specialize in helping people work with the technology, and that's where we form a really powerful pairing, because I focus on the technology and the governance side. Megan focuses on the adoption. Between the two of us, hopefully we do a decent job and our clients are actually happy. And we actually kind of mostly work for a company called Insync Technology, but we also work for ourselves as Strand Consulting, where we can say and do what we like. So what are we talking about? We're talking about making the marriage work. So if anybody follows us on Twitter, they see that we actually do a little bit of, I don't know, I guess traveling with our kids, and we drag them around with us. They'll be Office 365 specialists one day as well.
Yeah, and I think Lorian touched on a good point. He's a technical one. I'm not technical. My background's psychology. So yeah, we definitely come from different sides and bring a lot of that into our projects. So what are we talking about today? Essentially in this session, yes, we're having a bit of play on the fact that we're married, but the reason why that came up was really that we wanted to talk about why our roles and our areas have to be really aligned, which made sense and compared interestingly to a marriage or any sort of union. So we wanted to, I guess, separate into the courting period or the dating period, and then also talking about the marriage and how that gets more complex and things like that. So before we dive in, just a few quick thoughts. So what are governance and adoption? So let's just touch on that.
So governance is, to be honest, something I never thought that I would really care much about. I always was more caring about the technology, but as we've come across and things have evolved, we need to understand how are we actually, what's the rules behind this? Why are we doing this stuff? So yeah, governance, the definition, if you look it up, is an action or manner governing a state. So rules, controls. So not just I've set the configuration this way, this is why I've set the configuration this way.
And adoption. So adoption, I feel like, has been a massive buzzword, particularly in the last few years, especially with the Microsoft space. Essentially, uptake. So getting people to use the thing. And today we're focused on Microsoft Teams. So looking at how we get people to actually use and follow and access and uptake Microsoft Teams. Firstly, before we go too quickly, I just wanted to touch on a rushed relationship and why a rushed relationship sometimes doesn't go well. So enabling without thought can show bad results. And I want to just look at this graph for a tick, just kind of driving home the importance of why we're going to talk about this stuff. This is from a project last year that we both worked on. This is a global organization. They had about 9,000 staff. And when we engaged with them, they said, we're fine. We've got 83% active users in Microsoft Teams. So I did an adoption metrics kind of review. And this is one of the graphs that kind of made me giggle at the time, but was really interesting. Look at chat messages, 41 million. And compare to the other core 4 factors of channel messages, meeting participants and calls. Barely, you can't even tell the color almost of those things on the graph. So this was a really interesting example of uptake of chat and how Microsoft Teams, when it just gets turned on, yeah, people work some stuff out, but there's so many fantastic features that weren't really embedded and weren't really there. So when you dive in too quickly, sometimes, you don't get the full results. All right, so you may already be in Microsoft Teams, or maybe you're yet to roll it out. What our perspective is today, and the way we're breaking this up, is essentially through these project phases of initiation, implementation, and what we would call, we decided, operation. So business as usual. So essentially with initiation, we see it as getting the picture clear before the deep work. Implementation, so that phase we see as prior to go live, so where the build is, building out the elements of the adoption strategy and the governance. And then operation is post go live. So we saw the go live of Teams going live as that line between implementation and then moving into business as usual. So just wanted to table that, I guess, for a terminology perspective, but also to think about and give the logic behind the structure of our session.
So let's start with the courting period, the dating, which is, do you want to go out with me? So looking at, for starters, now we're a little bit beyond the requirement of, are we going to use Microsoft Teams or Zoom? That's a topic for another day. But we want to understand is who is actually driving this conversation? Who is leading? How are we starting this project, this program? Or if you're already doing it, how are we course correcting and who's responsible for it? So if we think about the dating phase, it's very much like that early stages of dating. So we have to ask things like, do you want kids? Do you want those two people we have in the other room? You want to keep them?
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, after lock-in, we'll see. Do you believe in a God? We might have fundamental difference on those kind of things. Or if we do, how do we deal with that? Cats or dogs for you?
Dogs.
Yeah, she's asleep next to us. So, so the thing is, it's important to actually understand these things. Now, how do we translate that to a business context? Well, do we want chat? Do we want people chatting? Do we want people to have all our files in the team? Do we want people to be working from anywhere? Thanks to COVID, now the answer is yes for absolutely almost everybody. But that's the thing is, before that, we had to actually think about what is it that we want from this, and are we aligned with what we're actually doing? Now, if you think about the Microsoft Teams application, now I'm not going to take you through all of these because, well, we already know it and you're already using it. But the reality, is that each one of these individual components of Microsoft Teams has its own areas of governance and control behind it. Different settings and policies result in different behaviors, and all those different behaviors result in different levels of adoption and usage. So chat and meetings and calling and voice and even the apps. So if you've got collateral talking about these amazing features in Microsoft Teams, yet for some reason the organization has turned them off, but that hasn't been communicated, then users are going to very rapidly start losing faith in the product. Conversely, if you haven't limited features, it's going to be very hard to take some of those things away after users have taken them up. So an organization that maybe has been creating groups and teams uncontrolled for a year, imagine coming in and afterwards and saying, you know what, we need to rein that back. How well do you think that's going to be received? So all of these need to be kind of considered and thought of as we kind of move through this process. So as I was saying, like with the dating side of things, we need to, pardon the pun again, marry the pillars of all these different elements of governance together. So why are Megan and I together? Why are we doing this? Why are we having children? Why are we? Because we want to make more mini MVPs. What are the outcomes we're trying to get to? So why are we doing Teams other than Microsoft has told us to? How are we going to go about it? Are we doing a phase rollout? Is it big bang? What are we turning on for the big bang? What are we doing with the rest of our Office 365 environment? What are we doing with our Cisco WebEx kit? What's the messaging? Because very few organizations are coming from nothing. Who's responsible for all these kind of things? Who is ultimately making the decision? Is it us in IT, or is it change and adoption and HR and people and culture? Are they deciding what is the future way of working because they're about the culture and the people, or do I decide the future way of working because I'm about the technology? Hence why we have this lovely marriage.
Okay, so let's talk about the adoption elements that come into the initiation phase. So one of the things that I love about this phase is that we're teaching the organization about Microsoft Teams, but at the same time, we're learning about their organization. We're being strongly connected with the governance side here is crucial. We need to understand what they're going to set up and how it's going to be used. And sometimes there's back and forth there because they need to, sometimes I represent the business a bit more, or certain needs of the business that maybe the governance or the technical stream haven't thought through, and we need to sort of go back and forth to make sure it's really fit for purpose. We need to talk about what are the ways of working. Some examples like that might be, well, chat for teachers is going to be different to chat for truck drivers. Channel setup for a finance division is going to be different to channel setup for a remote emergency services team. And those are all types of roles that I've worked with. They all exist and they all want to use Teams really effectively. So what tech will those roles be enabled with? Will it be just chat and calling, or will it be full teamwork? And then we need to think about what success looks like. For example, so what are the goals of usage and user satisfaction? Sounds silly to say what's a goal for user satisfaction, but realistically, maybe you don't want to drive a lot of some features, but some others are really critical, and so you can monitor that. All of the elements on this side are important to drive understanding, to build out the detail, and design basically a digital workplace. So you can see here, you know, even things like this, I'm sure there's words here you're all familiar with, you know, personas, user groups, use cases. We're effectively not just looking at little ways and features to use, we're designing ways of working, and it's all really critical. Then I guess one of the final stages of this phase is a high level strategy. So bringing it all together, the locations, the users, the campaigns, staggering groups into it, or the way you're going to handle rollout, and the activities that you'll run to really support that. So this slide shows actually a high level strategy from a project a while ago, last year at some stage, but essentially I wanted to bring it up to show essentially, as I just said, everything coming together. I love pulling these strategies together because where it begins is the blue at the top. So the top section it's heavy led by the technical. The governance usually drives the roadmap and considers what's the place for teams in the timeline and the organization. And there can be technical non-negotiables. So along with that, there's also maybe areas of flex. So we consider the best way to impact people. For example, maybe we're going to only roll out chat and calling because it's a voice project, and you know, people have to get used to no more handset on their desk. And then maybe we'll bring in teamwork later when the dust is settled and they're open to kind of experiencing more use with the application. Then once we have that kind of probably top half, and we really look at proof of concepts versus sort of phase of the project, the thing then that I get pretty dorky and excited about is the campaigns. You know, I get quite excited about and obsessed about what is the story? What are we saying to people? Because it's not just we're turning on an application and we're giving you a new application. You know, you can make it really interesting and really powerful. So particularly that orange phase in there, you know, it can be anything from we're strengthening our foundation, or we have this new modern communication, and you can, you know, create whole campaigns and launch and activities and things that fall under that. And then of course there's training. So as I mentioned before, sometimes we just focus on maybe one module or two modules, chat and just calls, and getting that happening, and then maybe across the business, and then maybe at say branches and other locations. So thinking about how you're phasing people in and what the journey is for them and the experience that they'll have. So you have to do all this with governance and adoption in mind, and awareness of the components and how they impact each other constantly. So implementation. So we've got here stuff's getting serious. So like when a couple take a major step and they move in together.
Like the one you're standing on?
It's a step, not a bucket. We see the wedding as the go live, and there's the planning that you do to prepare for the wedding. The implementation is like we see it as the build phase. So you're preparing everything for that big moment. You know, it's all getting serious. You're planning everything together and you're building up to something. Setting up teams, channels, configuration, you're putting controls in place, maybe ensuring that staff can't just create teams themselves, you know, things like that, and getting it all ready. So as I mentioned, the wedding's like the go live. Okay, there's a lot of complex details leading up in the implementation. You've got to choose the entree for the reception, and maybe you've got to decide whether you want to have salmon or chicken.
And look, I guess the male generally is not necessarily interested in all of these details. whether your dress is beige or cream, or whether it has a frill over here or there. So that's the thing, is much like that in the workplace, I'm also not necessarily concerned about screenshots for training guides and who the pilot users are. However, the thing is, there's still important elements to consider as part of the marriage or the go live.
Adoption doesn't need to know if we're installing Exchange with the 2016 hybrid, blah, blah, technical, blah, blah, blah. We just need to make sure that the groom shows up on the day. Okay. So we're not interested in the low level detail usually of each other, but we know what's important and what we have to be across.
So taking that kind of extension of the marriage a bit further, right? So if you think about all the things that Megan may have had to go through for our wedding, and the reality is we actually, I think we were pretty even with ours, weren't we?
Yeah, we eloped.
Yeah, but we planned all the elopement.
It's all a lie.
So, you know, so while some people prefer to get married by a judge, or like we did, we eloped, you know, for others, it's a process that requires a lot of planning. So often in a team's deployment, we've got a lot of different things we need to go through. So these are often done by just IT with almost virtually no input from the business, because as Megan said, thinking about all these kind of things in terms of the migration and the configuration of apps and the deployment of things, are we really going to necessarily involve adoption? And that's the problem, because that's the issue in how we've gone about it. So this is like if Megan organized a big wedding and just told me that I needed to be in a particular place at a particular time, and as long as I have my eyebrows, that's all that matters. But the reality is, I kind of want to know something about it, because, I don't know, maybe we're getting married in a swamp and you're going to baptize me as part of the process. I don't know. So that's the thing, is we kind of need to actually be somewhat involved in the conversation, even though it's not necessarily our core one, because the end outcome, like the marriage, that's the thing that we have to be on the same page about. So we need to work backwards from there. So even though we've got all these different areas of planning, one of the things that Megan and I have experienced over the years is often adoption is brought in at the end, like, hey, we've planned out this huge project, we're going to go live. Can you just do some comms, maybe some training guides? You know, what if the experience is a terrible one you're about to launch? Have you tested it? Have you gotten some UAT? Have you gotten some feedback? Have you looked at ways of working? So instead, our approach is actually, Megan often is the one who comes in first, or sometimes it's actually the other way around. We start with adoption first, which is what is it you're trying to do? And then we figure out the technical and the governance to support that end outcome. So if we think about Office 365, there is a ton of features that we have to think about. There's a lot of considerations that we have to take into consideration. Well executed there, Lauren. On all these different aspects of the Microsoft 365 platform as how they align to Microsoft Teams. Because if we do something over here, that may affect how Microsoft Teams works over there. So if we disable stream or remove the license, then that may affect how people can do video calling. Or if we disable guests in groups, but we leave it on in Teams, well, then it's not really going to work well. So all these little things we have to think about. We can't just say, I'm deploying Teams, all I care about is Teams. No, Teams sits on top of Office 365. Without Office 365, Teams doesn't work properly. So we need to consider that. Now, the challenge that we also have is things about just going beyond Office 365 itself is then actually the Teams platform. It's not that small. It is not a case of we've installed the desktop client, it seems to work okay. No, there's a lot of things behind the scenes that we have to consider. And like all these different options, we have to think about, well, what's the user impact of this? Because if I have disabled the ability as IT, because I like my governance and I like my control, and I've disabled the ability for guests to edit sent messages, but that's not communicated because I don't care, it's a security thing. Why should I tell you? What's going to happen when guests are in the tenant and they say to our end users, hey, I can't edit my sent message? The person's going to say, oh, well, that's strange. I can. Must be broken. Have you rebooted your computer? And that's the problem, is we haven't actually thought about what the end user experience is like.
So let's talk a bit about the adoption factors in the implementation phase. Implementation.
Plantation.
So as mentioned before, implementation is the build and prepare phase. So if you think about the waterfall method, it's a bit like that. I mean, I think Office 365 projects in general have to remain agile because of enhancements and features and just, it's the way many organizations are delivering things these days. But in some ways, we do have to bring a bit of waterfall in, the old 70% planning, 30% implementation. We need to really have a clear starting point and review all the detail, because we can't just throw it out there and adapt too much, because people need a starting point. Okay. One of the key wins that I find in adoption and the change space is having a sandpit for screen capture and knowing that lower level detail so we can actually prepare scenarios and visual content, because that's the stuff that can really add value for people. Having context and more detail about the way of working with teams and how their business unit or department and what value they're going to get from teams is really important. Lorian stole my example, I think. Can guests edit or delete posts? But also things like, is the organisation going to enforce MFA for guests? I'm in a lot of external tenants, and when I tenant switch, some of them it does enforce MFA, and others it doesn't. So we need to prepare guests coming in to work with us on projects or in whatever way they'll join for their experience and make sure they're not confused. So you can see there are a lot of factors here, and I love putting these visuals up. Obviously, a lot of us have probably heard of ADCAR, so having that method and understanding and preparing across the project. But also one thing that I also love that I've got up there is a change readiness, and whatever your document is really thinking about leading up to the wedding, thinking about the go live and thinking about areas across the business that you want involved, who needs to be prepared, have you got comms to help write some stuff, who's designing training, and some organizations, this might all be one person, some it might be 6. But basically, have a think through the factors and things to prepare and make sure the boxes are ticked. This slide I like bringing into presentations because I find it's a really great visual. The learning journey of the user is critical. It's something that, as I said earlier, I'm really passionate about the story and what people go through. None of the stages of learning are possible without clear governance, though, and true alignment. How would I know all those things if we didn't, pass information back and forth and work together? So, for example, formal training without a sandpit is not going to work. You can't just talk to teams without people having a go hands-on, or even just screenshots for user guides. You need that sandpit and an environment to match the final detail as well. Has anyone ever worked on a project where you get some sort of version of a product, but when it goes live, it looks a bit different? It's not the same. I have an example right now of a current client. We got called in to give support recently. They all have to work from home. People are suddenly struggling, to even join calls to run effective meetings. And this is last week, so it's very recent. When we went in there and went, okay, what are the things that we can do to drive change and drive, improvement? I found out that the first thing they said was, can you help people know how to install Microsoft Teams on their computers? Can you help them know how to open Teams and what a team is? This company has rolled out Teams a year ago. Okay. So just an example of how, if things aren't aligned and there isn't a clear journey, how do you know who's keeping up and where they're at? The journey slide here shows the early stages of what's coming. So it's really great to have the checkpoints. What's coming and awareness concepts versus what's it going to be? What is this thing we're talking about and when is it coming? And by the time you get through the journey, you know how to use it for your day-to-day job. I had a project about 2 weeks ago. Again, we got pulled in because they were rolling out Teams and they wanted a hand. And I said to them, what's going to happen at 9 o'clock on Monday? What do people need to know? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, when people come into work on Monday, you've migrated and done all these things and things that Teams is also there on Monday. What do people need to do and how are they going to use it? And they said, we hadn't thought of that. So they hadn't thought about the person on the other side and any of the staff and the impact on them. So put yourself in those shoes and really help that prepare. Now, through implementation, I've gone on and on and on about all the detail, users, personas, groups, training, build it all. At the end of it all the elements come together prior to the wedding, prior to the go live. And this is a low level strategy. This is very, very old, I think, from CRM days or something. But essentially, it just shows a plan on a page of all your streams coming together in the key activities, like a wedding. DJ, check. Menu, check. Photographer, check. Even if you're already in Office 365, by enabling Microsoft Teams, you need to think about what's going to be wrapped up in your ways of working? Are there knowledge gaps? You know, you can't just build a team and have tabs and say our template for everyone is posts, library, wiki, a notebook, a planner, something else. And then people say, but we never learnt to use a OneNotebook. What's that? And can we share them across our departments? Knowledge gaps will arise. Think about all the apps that are part of this digital workplace and really get into the detail and make sure they're ready. All right, so we've gone through implementation. We've gone on and on and on about the detail. We've argued over the entree, and we got through the marriage. Just
got through it. We're done.
No, we got through the wedding. Then the tough starts. Don't they say the first year of marriage is the hardest? I don't know. But in all seriousness, you know, that a big event has happened. It all builds towards the pivotal moment. And both governance and adoption. Now this sounds like two weird, nerdy people called governance and adoption.
We should write a storybook. One day, governance went along for adoption.
They're preparing for the end users in the platform or the application.
Those are the kids.
So what happens next? That feels like a story. So neither governance or adoption are set and forget. Okay, so they're in there. People are using it. It's been rolled out, and now what happens? Business just continues. There will always be ways to adapt. Microsoft Teams is constantly growing, which is fantastic. New features, enhancements. So you don't just roll out the training, get them all in there and then walk away. Not only because there's new features, but as people learn and they'll grow, you know, they get in there lacking confidence and being worried and thinking, oh, I can chat, phew, oh, I joined a call. But once they get the hang of it, they get a taste for it, they can stretch themselves. And so the way they work can advance over time. And it's important to just keep them motivated and get them curious and get them to extend and learn.
And I guess like marriage, kids come along and we need to then adapt and change things there. And so some of the challenges that we have is, as Megan said, new features come along, things change, new features come along, new features are removed, features change behavior, features merge into others. And we have to think about how do we actually manage that. So if, for example, you thought as a smart organization, we had controlled the apps of Office 365 and we stopped users from using Staff Hub because we didn't want to, we didn't want them using it, but then now Staff Hub has become shifts in Teams. So now you've got somewhere else you need to manage it. So one of the things that's really important is, from a governance perspective, is to actually be open about the governance to end users. Because most times when it comes to governance, it is a Word document that was developed by an external consultant for a lot of money, stuck in a filing cabinet, be it virtual or physical, that is referred to once in a blue moon. Because that's how we paid. We did it, you know, 3 years ago. We paid a lot of money. That's how it's done. But the reality is, as I said, the technology changes. So we need to use the technology to support the technology. So instead of having a governance document, have a governance site. Share information with end users about new features that are coming, features that are being removed, but also share information about why they can't have certain features. Let's say, for example, I had a phone call with a client today who wants to roll out Teams for chat, but they're not really ready for OneDrive because they weren't ready to do any of it, but they have to do something now. So if they decide to roll it out without OneDrive, then they need to communicate to their users, hey, here's Teams, we've limited it to this level, and here's what's coming, and here's why you can't have it now, because users need to understand that. So we need to provide the guidance about why they can have certain features, why certain things are disabled, but also our own what to use when, because you can see a session from Megan or myself talking about what to use when, but it's generic. It's not applicable to your organization. So that needs to be custom tailored to your organization, because your what to use when is not necessarily OneDrive, SharePoint, Yammer, Teams. It actually might be Documentum. It might be Trim, and then OneDrive and other things. So you have to actually consider those kind of things. You also have to think about what are the roles and responsibilities, because historically, when it comes to IT platforms, the roles and responsibilities fall to IT. But we live in this world where users get to control and change the features themselves. So if Megan shares a file with an external person, is it my job as IT to remind her of that? Or is she an adult who should actually be responsible for her own files? And that's the juggle that we have, because you'll have, for example, from a group's creation perspective, you'll have users saying, I don't want IT to tell me when I can and can't create a group or a team. But then if you ask that same person, well, whose responsibility is it to clean up those teams and move those files around and make sure that content isn't lost? They'll say IT. So that's the thing, is there has to be a balance there. We have to juggle that. So we have to figure out who's the roles and responsibility, who can be an owner of a team and what they can and can't do. And as I said, like what features are turned off, because maybe we've turned off private channels for the entire organization. So it doesn't matter if you're an owner or not.
And if I can just jump in and cut you off, because that's what wives do.
They do.
Spouses, not just women. No, something I did want to add there is don't be afraid to be transparent. You know, obviously my role is heavily with the end user side, and I often work with maybe IT leaders or IT teams, and sometimes they say, we want this project to make our reputation better in the organization because maybe there have been things in the past that staff didn't understand, and so they got frustrated. Sometimes I see things happen, like maybe security is a really touchy one, I think, sometimes. So it's okay to be transparent and explain things to people so they understand. However, the language is important. You know, don't say we're rolling out Intune just in case you quit your job. Say we're rolling out Intune to protect our data and make sure your work isn't compromised. You know, so do think about the language, but if people understand, I think they come to the party and, you know, they're more accepting and on board with things.
And I think actually that's a very salient point, because if you think about things like multi-factor authentication, users don't want multi-factor authentication. They don't care about it. But why is it important to them? As Megan said, from a language perspective, multi-factor authentication secures your account, which means there's less chance of you getting compromised, because a compromise may result in financial damage to the organization, reputational damage, loss of income, loss of ability to employ you. So that's the thing, is by protecting themselves and their account and their employer, they are in fact protecting their own jobs. So it's very important to kind of explain that language. So then how do we manage governance from an operational perspective? I talked about turning it into a site, not a document. The other thing is, from a governance perspective, it has to be regularly maintained, reviewed, and constantly adapted, because new features turn out all the time. They show up one day in one particular interface for one organization or one user, but not necessarily another. So it's very important to be continually on top of the service. It's not like it used to be in the old days where there'd be a service pack coming out and we'd say, I'll wait until somebody else has installed it and we'll see if there's any hot fixes and then we'll deploy it. Or we can install it on a test lab and see what happens to that server. We don't have that luxury. Features get shipped to us all the time. So part of that is we need to maintain a list of what products we do and don't use. And again, make that available to staff so they can say, I've heard about this bookings app. Why don't I have it? Well, because for this reason, this is why it's not enabled. Or it is enabled, but not for everybody, and here's why. One of the things that I do is create an Office 365 tools guide that lists every single product, whether you have it or not, and explains whether you have it or not and why you may not actually have it. So users can actually go to that explains governance decisions in human language. And we also need to keep a register of all decisions relating to Office 365, because the amount of times I've worked with organizations and said, hey, why is your OneDrive sharing set to disabled for external users? And their response is, oh, I don't know. I guess somebody said at some point, makes sense. Does it? Why? Do you block Dropbox.com as a URL? Do you block drive.google.com? Do you block email attachments? No. Then why have you blocked external sharing? So that's the thing, is a lot of times people actually, there's no record of the decisions that were made, or maybe they're buried in an as-built document when their mailbox migration was originally done, but nothing has been updated ever since. So it's important to keep a track of why you have changed certain settings, why you've disabled features when they've come out, why you've turned Cortana off, why you've disabled Azure speech services, why you've rolled some things out to some people but not others. How we actually do these is the message center, is the roadmap, and also the audit log. The amount of organizations that I speak to that don't actually know of the audit log's existence. The amount of organizations that I speak to that say, how do you keep track of all these new features that are coming out to Office 365? We just don't know when they're coming, or when they're enabled on our tenant, stuff just appears. So I say, well, why don't you go to the message center and look? Oh, I don't have the time to go into the portal. I wish it sent me an email. It does send you an email. You'd probably just delete it or ignore it. Oh, I guess so. And that's the thing is, so they're actually sitting on top of this, but that's the thing is governance requires attention. It requires time investment. It doesn't just require skills and knowledge. It requires investment in time for us to say, hey, Megan, there's a new feature coming along. What do you think is the impact of this? I guess we'll just let it happen because she doesn't seem to care. But it's important to look at that. It's also important to look at the roadmap so that we don't have users going off and getting shadow IT. So for example, like people going off to getting Zoom because it supports up to 50 faces in a video call at one time, when we'll say, hey, did you know that Teams is getting 3x3 video? Is that enough to keep you? Oh, okay, good. And away we go. And also the audit log actually allows us to see what's happening in our tenant. So if Megan shares a document with somebody that shouldn't, then I can actually see that, I can action that. I don't necessarily have to block the domain. If Megan has been given a performance warning and all of a sudden starts deleting a bunch of files or even a bunch of emails, we can see that through the audit log. But most people don't know this, and so they try to fix the damage after it's already been done. Whereas we can start to see patterns emerging. We can see that Megan shared a sway externally and, well, what was in there because we have no DLP. So it's important to actually look at all these and actually spend the time on them, trawling through them, having alerts set up so that we can be alerted when something actually happens and something that we actually care about.
The message center is a key one for me, and that's why I didn't respond, because I was holding on to a thought. I need governance. I need the technical people involved to be aware of stuff, because I'm not going to. And sometimes if I do go into message center, you know what, even if I go to a conference, I think tech. I need someone to explain all that to me. Oh yeah, there's a range of features coming that I get, and they're more straightforward. And so I do rely heavily on that relationship. You know, if Florian had $1 for every time I said, hey, and asked him a question about stuff.
Wait, hang on, it'd be my $1 you'd be giving to me?
Yeah, I'd get it anyway, yeah. But so for ongoing adoption, the relationship is critical. And one of the things that comes to mind when I think about this phase is a working group. You know, you have to kind of accept that things are going to change going forward, and you need to be change adaptable or change capable and ready. And this maybe isn't big effort. You know, we've talked a lot about this, and we've talked to a couple of organizations in particular. And I think, you know, it could just be 4 hours a month. It could be one working group a month. You know, you may just need a technical person to be across Message Center weekly, and you could get together for an hour a week, an hour a month, and present. And if they're really on top of it, they go, here are the things, these two, and we look at them. And so I even do that when I go to a conference, is I do my own impact assessment of the things that I know are coming, to just get my head around them and understand how to prepare customers. And so what I'm presenting, I guess, on this slide is just continuous improvement and agile cycle. So it's really important to be aware of the features and involve the right people across the organization. Private channels, as an example, how will that be used? And or any of the features, you know, what business areas need to be aware, because is it going to change process within the organization and how they use Teams to do certain things? Part of the other thing to keep in mind when you get new features and when you do these assessments and think about what's coming is decisions around learning and communication. And these are really important as well, as you'd be aware. We can look at things and we can maybe just, you know, have a simple table where we have the name of the thing that's coming, you know, a bit of detail about it, and literally think about what will it mean? What will people have to do to understand, or will they even see it? Some things can just be comms. Some things might just be, oh, by the way, something's changing next week, a button's changing from blue to yellow. Or will it be, you really need to be aware of this, because if you're not, you know, something may get deleted or be changed and it's more critical. So at the end of the day, I think of this area as very agile, you know, things coming along and having a number of roles, react and assess, and it's almost like divide and conquer. You've got learning and development, or you've got, you know, certain areas involved, and they all have a look, have a meeting, come together, and then, you know, disseminate information and updates out to the organization. So you need to be adaptive ongoing. It's not a huge effort, I don't think, but it's important.
I'm having a fight over the mouse right now.
Sorry.
So a couple of really good, simple, real-world examples is private channels and sharing links. Now, when private channels, it's out in the wild, everybody already has it. But for a lot of organizations, they didn't even know that it was coming. They didn't know what it did, how it worked under the hood, what it did. It was just like, it was a feature that we really, really want. Now, the problem is the default policy is that everybody in the organization can create a private channel. Now, if you actually understand what a private channel is and the architecture behind it that I'm not going to go into today, that can actually be a bit of an issue if every single person can do it. So there's a simple switch to turn that off, or we can create a policy to allow some people to be able to do it. But that's a really good scenario of where a feature was coming, people didn't know what it meant, as in IT didn't know what it meant, and users didn't know what it meant, and it just started rolling out, and all of a sudden private channels were just everywhere.
How long have private channels been around?
Only a few months.
Yeah, but there are still customers we work with where when I mention it, they have no idea what I'm talking about.
But their users do.
Yeah, but it's the other side of it as well. So there are many companies that not across the new features that are coming and will be easily 6 months behind something because they haven't got around to it. And it is a good example that's really valuable. You know, imagine being able to be a manager and having private channels across your staff to have notebooks and actions and things. So there's many, many good use cases. And so it's a shame on the flip side when an organization just didn't get across it and it could have really rocked their world.
Yeah, and that's similar to that is things like sharing links. So one organization that Megan and I work with relatively often, their sharing links for some reason were set to anonymous links. So even if I was to create a share a file internally with Megan, she would actually be accessing the document as a guest, even though she's internal, because the default sharing link was an anonymous link. And so whether or not we allow anonymous or not, there's a problem there in that the experience is like, if I share that particular link with several people internally, I don't know who's modified it because they're all just showing up as GC, guest contributor. So to change that from a governance perspective or from an adoption perspective is we have to look at the different components, because maybe we actually do want to decrease the sharing. We maybe want to still allow anonymous links, but we want to change the default sharing action. The problem is that's now become a way of working. It's muscle memory. People are working with this already. So we have to think about what are the different options I've got from a governance perspective and the technology configuration perspective, but how do I message that? How much change can people handle in one go? Do we simply say, right, it's changing and this is what it is, done? Or is it actually a staged approach and we do it over a number of ways and I don't get my governance tick box for 4 weeks because we've actually decided to do it in increments?
And some of it's really complicated. I think let's assume that a lot of people on this call, if you are technical professionals, you'd be well aware, or maybe if you're business people, sharing links is one of the most slowly adopted things. It's one of the things whenever I go into an organization that they say people don't get how to set rules for sharing links. It's just really complex and not something people do day to day or in anywhere else in their life. And it's been one of the hardest things to drive. So it can be surprisingly complex.
Yeah, we deal with organizations that are really heavy Teams users, but still don't understand the fundamental principles of OneDrive and SharePoint sharing. So wrapping this up, if we don't have an alignment, and this will actually appeal to the people in the UK who actually understand where this photo is probably taken, this stuff falls apart really quickly. So we think that we're getting Office 365 to combat shadow IT. The reality is if we do a bad job of governance or adoption, we're actually going to be inviting shadow IT. People will find their way around things. If I've turned something off and made it too restrictive in Office 365, they're just going to go around it and do something else. And that's actually worse because I can't see what they're doing. So it's actually quite important to say, hey, Megan, there's a new feature coming. Here's what the impact is. How do you think we should broach it? Should we turn it off? What do you think the users can handle? How much change can they handle? Because Teams is about to change the button layout from somewhere else. So it's important to actually do that. And also, because even though Office 365 is a journey, not every organization has deployed every workload. So if you're starting to say, hey, well, now we're going to roll this particular feature out, don't bring in adoption afterwards to just do some comm stuff, because it's just offensive to say, hey, you're an afterthought. But it's also going to lead to a really poor experience for the end users.
It makes certain roles in the organization, it makes their life really hard work, because if I'm brought in late and there's a feature and I go talk to business areas about how something's going to change, there can be real anxiety and stress because it's impacting a process, and I don't want to be that messenger. And so, yeah, no matter where you are in your Office 365 journey, you just need to take the time to think about things to date and how you can improve going forward. You might find that you don't even know your change manager's name or your learning person's name. Right now, this is an intervention. You can actually, even going forward, just begin to have some discussions monthly and be able to enable them to do, set everything up for success, because people will be across it. You need to have it's mutual objectives, and you can have a plan, and it doesn't take a lot of work to ongoing, absorb change and understand it and work together.
So, great time for my keyboard and mouse to stop working.
Works for me. Just got to have the right.
I unplugged and replugged it. Governance and adoption, right there. User experience, technology.
We planned that.
So I guess this is the opportunity where people can then unmute and ask us any questions, or here's our contact details if you have any questions afterwards. Otherwise, we'll just stand here awkwardly.
I'll just keep sipping my tea.
I was just drinking from my Teams bottle, which I think I have to do this way. That doesn't work. So how about that local sporting team?
Is there anyone on the call, just out of curiosity, who thinks they have a really great, I guess, ongoing method or centre of excellence type approach to absorb enhancements across their organisation?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I have an organisation who flicks between we want to use this, no, we're too scared. And it's a battle. And I'm just still having that same battle this morning. Just the okay, yes, we want to take this on, we're going with this, and then, oh, no, right, stop, don't want to. And it's trying to keep the momentum going and trying to keep them interested and understanding how good it is. And I'm struggling with that. I don't know where the negativity that keeps hitting them comes from. So really struggling with it.
And Claire, are you, have you found it's changed in the last few weeks? And I don't like referring back to our current global situation because it's not positive, but to be honest, so we've both been working over the last couple of months with organisations who have said, take it slow, not ready. And it was amazing that over the last few weeks, a few turned around and went, yep, help us go, get in there. Has there been any motivation for working from home and changing it now?
So pretty much majority, well, office staff are all working from home. We're in 14 different countries, so there's differences across which countries are locked down or how they're handling this. It's actually made them, I think, a little more lethargic about it, because people are picking up Teams and then they don't need to actually put their heads on the line saying we should use it, because people are using it anyway because of this situation. It feels a bit, all right, what we're doing, we're not grabbing a hold of this and making sure. It feels like they've kind of just.
Someone keeps muting everyone.
Yeah, somebody keeps muting us all. Sorry, Claire. There was a pivotal comment you were finishing with and you got muted.
You hear me again?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just the idea that they feel as though, okay, it's happening now, so we don't need to put our names to it. And it'll evolve as it's evolving, which that's a little bit how it feels at the minute. We've got bigger things to worry about.
Yeah, have a think about the graph that we showed at the start. So, yes, I think we would all understand that organisations, everyone's hurting right now, as in everything's hard at the moment. And so, yes, there's a reason to not take on another project and not think about another tool. Remember that there is learning pathways. So you could take an approach of just do what we can. Enable learning pathways so people are directed to all the Microsoft content if they want to self-learn, but maybe just don't battle too hard, and in a couple of weeks or at some point look at the metrics to show, like that graph, do we realize everyone's chatting, and maybe we could support people understanding more features, because maybe, and Lauren will talk in a sec, but one thing that we've noticed as well is a lot of our customers want me right now to train and help our area get it going. And governance, they're sort of going, oh, too hard right now, we'll think about it later.
Yes, that is true. I feel quite rejected. but no, that's not what I wanted to talk about. What I would actually suggest, and this is more probably an adoption point, is I've had this with a few organizations recently where I'm dealing with someone who's halfway between users and users and tech, and they're struggling to get the investment, the attention, and this is well before COVID. What you can actually potentially do is a user satisfaction survey to actually show that users are hurting. Hey, IT, you need to do something about this. You need to invest in the skills, the resource, whatever, to get this done right. Because one of the things that I do is a technology impact assessment before I design roadmaps, and I ask very few technical questions. I ask about how well a project's delivered, and then how well do they stick around? Does my manager, deliver to the values? And ask very businessy type questions, but that still relate back to the technology.
I think also think about how people are finding it. If you did a survey and you could show this percentage of our staff say that they collaborate in SharePoint, this much in OneDrive, this much in Teams. So if you can show that there's actually confusion and inconsistency, that can also help drive more support. One organisation where it got pulled into last week, we're starting off with a retrospective, and we're using Planner to have the buckets of what's not working well, what confuses me, and what does work well. And we're asking all the company, put cards and give feedback so we can look at our pain points and start trying to help everyone work better from home because they're struggling. And the other thing to think about is how can you get the top down? How can you get leaders, walking the talk, talking the talk. So you might be able to just step back from no one wants to support us, and how can we maybe do some pockets slowly to maybe get things better? Do we have to jump off at 7:50?
We do shortly, but
Okay.
Quick, let's do a selfie with everybody in our live
With the
audience.
crowd. Any other questions? Sorry, others. No?
No, we better put the kids to bed.
All right, so we did bring up the slide. There were two important slides at the end. One was to do with feedback, and one was our details. Reach out on socials if you ever have questions or if you want to have further discussions. We hope your team's journey is a good one, and enjoy the rest of your day.
And thanks to the Team Fest organisers for having us here. Oh, we're not doing the boom thing? No.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
we don't usually do that.
So you've got to plan stuff out, otherwise it just fails epically.
That was just awkward.
Yeah.